Okay, great. Good morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Sally Hopley. I'm the coordinator of sustainable practices here at Metropolitan Community College. Welcome to another edition of the Claire M. Hubbard Sustainability Series. Before we start today's presentation, we have a few appreciations. So thank you to the Claire M. Hubbard Foundation, whose support has allowed MCC to develop this series of sustainability presentations at no charge to the public. Your generosity is much appreciated for this important work. Also, thank you to our MCC IT staff for their work and to our speaker, Anthony, for sharing your knowledge and your time today. Today's topic is about the connection between climate change and equity. It doesn't take too much digging to see how climate change, specifically environmental pollution, is connected to equity. It is important to remember these connections as we work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and create a healthy and thriving future for all. A note on audience participation. So in today's Zoom link, you will see if you hover on the bottom of your screen, there are two options. One is chat and one is Q&A. We encourage you to use the chat during the presentation to speak amongst yourselves. And at the end of today's talk, we will have time for a moderated Q&A. And that is when we would like you to use that Q&A feature, please. So again, chat during the presentation to talk amongst yourselves, Q&A afterwards to enter your questions. And you can also enter questions during the event, but that's where we'll be looking to see what questions you might have for our speaker today. If you are having some tech problems, please enter that in the chat as well. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Anthony Rogers-Wright serves as the Director of Environmental Justice for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. In this capacity, he guides and coordinates the organization's EJ strategy, litigation, organizing, and advocacy initiatives. Prior to joining the NYLPI, Anthony was the policy coordinator and Green New Deal policy lead with the Climate Justice Alliance, where he assisted with developing and sharing local, state, and federal organizing and policy strategy for the Alliance's 74 grassroots frontline-led organizations across the country. A veteran of social justice campaigns, Anthony helped lead the effort to make the former Colorado Health Insurance Cooperative the first health insurance provider in the state's history to remove transgender exclusions from all of their policies in 2012. He acted as the policy advisor for numerous candidates for elected office, including Senator Elizabeth Warren's campaign in 2020 and Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2020 and 2016, when he represented the campaign during testimony to the DNC Platform Committee. Anthony was selected as one of Grist.org's 50 environmentalists he'll be talking about in 2016. He's written numerous articles discussing the nexus of climate change crisis and racial injustice, and has spoken on the subject at universities throughout the US and Europe. Anthony serves on the board of directors of Friends of the Earth, Backbone Campaign, and Center for a Sustainable Economy, as well as the advisory committee for Evergreen Action. He is blessed to be the father of his energetic and very loquacious 6-year-old son, Zahir, AKA Bean. Anthony received his BA in Environmental Science and Policy and his master's degree in Community Development, Environmental Science, and Public Policy from Clark University in Massachusetts. Anthony, thank you so much for being here today. And with that, I shall turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally. It's great to be here. I really wish this was in person. We'll have to change that soon. I'll actually be coming back to Nebraska in a few weeks to visit a good friend who's going to be joining us soon from his farm. But thank you to all of you who have joined. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope this works. Great. And we'll play from the start. So as Sally said so accurately, this discussion is entitled Getting to the Root, and I'm actually going to time myself. This is what I do when I speak. I'm a New Yorker, so I tend to be long-winded, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So I'm starting my own accountability measures right now. But as Sally said, we really want to explore the nexus between equity, racial justice, and the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. And that's what we're going to get into today. So just a quick menu of what we'll get into. I don't even need to talk about myself. I think Sally did that adroitly. Thank you again, Sally, for that beautiful introduction, including getting some shout outs to my 6-year-old. He'll appreciate that. We need to talk about how to reframe how we talk about climate change. A lot of the times we talk about it in a very linear way, but it is so intersectional, and there's so many intersectional issues that contribute to this crisis. We will talk about climate change as a system of oppression, and you've heard probably the term the anthropocene. A lot of us recently have been saying, no, it's actually more akin to a racial capitalocene, and we'll talk about what that means. And then we'll talk about the implications of this crisis happening in Nebraska right now. Some of you have seen many of the acute impacts of the climate crisis just recently with flooding, but the implications for Nebraska go much longer than that, especially when you consider that one of your chief industries, agriculture, is particularly being impacted by this crisis today. So then we'll talk about false solutions. We are about to, as many of you may know, commence the global climate talks, the Council of Parties, known as the COP, number 26, which is starting in a few days, as a matter of fact, in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. And we'll talk about some of the false solutions that are going to be brought to that conference and why they won't work at all, including some that have actually been proposed in local Nebraska municipalities like Lincoln, who actually did produce a decent climate action plan. So we'll talk about that briefly. We'll talk about true solutions that I had a great opportunity and continue to be a part of with an organization I started in Nebraska called Regenerate Nebraska. And we'll be joined by my good friend, hopefully Graham Christensen, who co-founded that organization and collective with me. He'll be calling from his farm where he's harvesting right now to really give you an amazing account of why agriculture can be a solutions multiplier. And then we'll open it up to some Q&A and some discussion. So with that, we'll get started. So look, we know we have this crisis. On Thursday, tomorrow, as a matter of fact, oil executives from BP, Exxon, Shell, the American Petroleum Institute will be appearing before the House Oversight Committee to basically testify about the fact that they have been implicated in funding climate denialism since the 1970s when they knew about it. So we know that this crisis is here. Denialism is really just an object to try to beguile the public, another element to the so-called culture wars. We can't deny this crisis anymore. It's here. So we know it impacts us all. It affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. And this is what we talk about with this idea of a climate gap. And the climate gap is simply the disproportionate and unequal impact of the climate crisis, specifically on people of color, indigenous, Black, brown, poor Asian, and yes, poor white people as well, and poor people in general. So that's what the climate gap is. That's going to form the basis of a lot of what we're going to be discussing today. Climate change is an issue of great importance for human rights as well. It's not just a series of natural phenomena, hurricanes and storms and tornadoes and droughts. It is also an issue of human rights and public health and social fairness, because it has profound consequences and a very real danger that poor neighborhoods, people of color, we're going to talk about that in a local context in a moment, will suffer even worse harms and hazards than the rest of so-called Americans. If we look at just what just occurred and what's still occurring with the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, there is a clear nexus between the people who are disproportionately impacted the most, dying the most from the pandemic: indigenous, Black, brown, Asian, poor people, people without access to healthcare, and the same people who are also being impacted disproportionately by the climate crisis. There's an absolute nexus, a covalent relationship, as a matter of fact, between those two populations. They're one and the same, as a matter of fact. So this is also what I was talking about earlier about the climate crisis being an intersectional challenge that we're also going to get to in a moment. So as I just stated, disasters, they're not just natural phenomena, right? They are driven by social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, policies that have been made over time, choices that have been made by our government, by our lawmakers, by lobbyists, by industry. And what I mean by that is that we think of disasters as, well, naturally occurring, earthquakes, hurricanes, because they're not thought to be directly caused by humans. But disasters are actually social constructs because they emerge from social economic situations of everyday life. And I'm sure if you like close your eyes right now and think about it, think about, your living environment, where you live, your municipalities, who are the people who are most likely probably going to be impacted, what we like to say first and worst. And I'm going to give props in a moment to one of the fathers of environmental justice who literally says that these communities are hit first and worst. Bottom line is that these disasters are not natural phenomena. They are indeed social constructs. And this brings me to reframing, how we talk about this climate crisis. I've crossed out Anthropocene. Why? The Anthropocene, it's not denying that climate change is absolutely caused by human activity. That's not what we're trying to say. But the Anthropocene evokes this connotation of the climate crisis really beginning at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So think mid-1800s, specifically in the United Kingdom, when industrial processes really started to explode, right? And that's when people, this is when we started really emitting mainly carbon dioxide in the form of coal combustion into the atmosphere. And that's when this epoch called the Anthropocene began. But some say, and I fall into this camp of the racial capitalism. It's like, oh no, we have to go back before that, before the Industrial Revolution, because as long as the climate crisis is solely articulated through an Anglo-centric lens, that is through the lens of mainly white people, and we get the majority of our information about the climate crisis from the same white people, and rarely from the people who are directly impacted by it, the people who I just spoke about. But we will never dismantle this crisis as we get closer and closer to what I like to call total global entropy, as we get closer to the 1.5 degree threshold that the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change has told us. If we exceed or warm this planet by more than 1.5 degrees globally, horrible, worse things are going to happen. Not just, a few glaciers melting, but massive sea level rise, which will lead to all kinds of social unrest. So that's why we have to reshape how we think about this climate crisis. A history of the racialized capitalocene, therefore, helps us understand that climate change is not about human hubris, but the long history of colonialism and racial capitalism and Promethean thinking, the idea that man, and specifically man, because patriarchy is one of the contributors to this crisis, can invent a mechanical, technical solution to any problem. And we're seeing that now. And we're going to talk about this idea of Promethean thinking when we speak more later about so-called false solutions. The capitalocene, as our good friend Jason Moore says, brilliant thinker, dates back to the 16th century, which we witnessed this discovery of the so-called New World. But people were brought through force, blood, and fire, right? The slave trade, the division of colonies amongst European powers, and the organization on a global scale of a racialized, gendered, and bonded workforce. Slavery and colonialism, therefore, had a deep impact on the world ecology, and therefore, this idea that the situation that we find ourselves in today started when we just started burning coal at a grander scale is myopic and not telling the full scale of what contributes to a global climate crisis. And then finally, we must, in our narrative of the racial capitalocene, integrate the long memory of colonialism's impact and the fact that destruction in the colonial era becomes very visible in the post-colonial era. And you don't need to speak to anyone else but people indigenous to the United States of America who are still traumatized by colonization and what they sometimes refer to as first contact with European settler colonialists. So this also brings us somewhat into a local context of this idea of ghettoization and climate vulnerability. What do we mean by that? We have a myth that some of our communities, whether it's Lincoln, whether it's Omaha, MCC, right, very, very close to a historic Black community of North Omaha, are what the Supreme Court refers to as de facto, just the accident. Some people have income, some people don't have enough income to move, to this neighborhood or that neighborhood, but it was not because real estate agents steered Black and white families to different neighborhoods or because there was white flight, so-called white flight from the urban areas into the suburbs. We know that's absolutely not true. We know that there is a practice called redlining. We know know that FDR's New Deal included and exacerbated that program of redlining, specifically to segregate Black and white, Black, brown, indigenous, and white people from each other. And so the truth is that while these things existed, the major reasons why we have ghettos, so-called ghettos in metropolitan areas, is because of these federal, state, and local governments, planning agencies, county commissioners, et cetera, even public service commissioners, in deciding where highways are going to bifurcate certain neighborhoods. You can see that I'm leading up to the specific situation in North Omaha. Stay with me, I'm going to get there, I promise. But this was explicit. It was racially purposeful policy. It occurred at all forms of government. It still does at all levels of government. Now it's more an issue of gentrification, but that's the reason why we do have these ghettos today, and we're reaping the fruits of those policies, as you can see with the social challenges, health challenges, same thing that I said, right? COVID-19, as I like to say, is the great elucidator. It elucidated all of the existing inequalities that had been in place for many, many, many years before the age of global pandemics through this type of practice by all levels of our government. And that also exacerbates the climate crisis. So in 1987, this is really the landmark report that gave birth, some would say, to the environmental justice movement and its approach to addressing the climate crisis, and saying this is a racialized crisis. So in 1987, the United Church of Christ commissioned this report, Toxic Waste and Race, led by the great Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who coined the phrase environmental racism while fighting a PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl plant that was located in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Warren County, North Carolina. And here's what they say, because a lot of the times we hear this argument, oh, it's not race, it's class, it's not class, it's race. But Toxic Waste and Race back in 87, sought to really get to the bottom of that argument and eviscerate it altogether. And here's what their findings came up with. Race proved to be the most significant among variables tested in association with the location of hazardous waste facilities. And this represented a consistent national pattern, not just in Warren County, not just in California, not just in the Bronx, but throughout the country, including Indian country, so-called Indian country, by the way. So think Pine Ridge, think Dakota Access Pipeline, think the recently canceled Keystone XL pipeline, and who would have, or who is, and who would have suffered the worst impacts of those pieces of fossil fuel infrastructure. Toxic Waste and Race also found that communities with the greatest number of commercial hazardous waste facilities also had the highest composition of racial and ethnic residents. Communities with 2 or more facilities are one of the nation's 5 largest landfills. The average minority percentage of the population, people of color, was more than 3 times that of communities without facilities, so 38% versus 12%. So they're basically saying that, and another finding that they had, by the way, was that a Black family with a household income of $100,000 was 6 times more likely to live near a polluting facility, a coal-fired power plant, PCB facility, rendering, than a white family with a household income of $50,000. Therefore, race is a big, big issue when we're talking about who is exposed and disproportionately to the agents of the climate crisis we find ourselves in. 20 years later, they did another report. Let's take a look and see if things have improved. There was a Democratic president named Bill Clinton. He instituted an executive order called 12898, which directed federal agencies to look at environmental racism and to address it. That was back in 1994. So in 2007, though, we found that in some cases it got worse. More than 5 million people of color, 2.5 million Latino and Latinas, 1.8 million African Americans, over 600,000 Asians and Pacific Islanders, and 62,000 Native Americans live in neighborhoods with 1 or more commercial hazardous waste facilities. So this is not that long ago, right? Host neighborhoods, the neighborhoods where these things are located, 56% people of color, whereas non-host areas are 30% people of color. And 20 years after the initial report came out, significant racial and socioeconomic disparities persist in the distribution of commercial hazardous waste and other polluted facilities. So essentially, the conclusion is that even after this landmark report came out, and 20 years after that, including the beginning of the first Black president of the United States, administration, excuse me, we still find ourselves in this situation. And 14 years after this report came out, as I'm about to show you, we are very much in the same place. And that is why recent studies, 2018 American Journal of Public Health confirmed the exact same thing. In every state except Virginia, North Carolina, New Mexico, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, where I'm calling you from now, non-white people have a higher exposure to particulate matter than white people do. The report also find that Black U.S. residents are exposed to more than 1.5 times more fine particulates, or PM10, PM2.5, that's associated with coal-fired power plants. Very, very small particles that get into your lungs, wreak havoc. Think bronchitis, obviously higher rates of asthma, cardiovascular disease. So Black people are exposed to it more than their white counterparts. Latinx, Latino U.S. residents exposed to 1.2 times more fine particulate matter. And people below the poverty line, 1.35 times more than particulate matter. So, as we're seeing, this is the report. I'll make it available to Sally if anybody wants to actually read it. It's only actually 5 pages, so it's not too bad. It's pretty dense, but it gets right to the heart of the matter that environmental racism is a major issue that has to be addressed if we are going to get to really a sense of efficacy when addressing this climate crisis. I put this slide together basically just to give an understanding of what we're talking about when we, a visual representation of what this climate crisis is, right? If you think of our emissions, that's the tap. We turn it on, the water is flowing and it's filling up our tub. Ideally, in the form of rainforests, like the Amazon rainforest, unfortunately, not like the rainforests in Indonesia, which are almost gone. We also have rainforests in Africa. When soil, as Graham and I are going to talk about in a moment, is left to do what it's allowed to do and not tainted with over-tilling and pesticides, that formed our drain, right? And so like in a natural process, like, yes, we could burn some fossil fuels because we had natural systems that would sequester, whether in our trees, in our soil, etc. That's the bathtub effect. But now the situation that we have when we're cutting down all of these trees, massive forest fires, our drain is clogged, right? At a time when we are accelerating, we have more emergent economies, whether it's China, India, Brazil, Australia, Iran, who are now, burning more emissions into the sky. We have an overflow now. So the clog is drained, the faucet is turned on even higher, and basically that's the situation that we find ourselves in. That's what's leading to more frequent storms, more powerful storms. It's basically the Earth's atmosphere, I should say, more specifically, its way of saying, your tub is overflowing, your drain is clogged, and you're either going to have to fix this clog and turn off the faucet a bit, or we are going to be in some real trouble. And that brings me now to everything that I was talking about, that climate change as a system of oppression, the intersection of white supremacy, of colonization, and a patriarchy. That is what leads to what we are fighting now: global, anthropogenic, racial capitality, and climate change. And I think that this quote by my dear friend Hop Hopkins of the Sierra Club says it best. You cannot have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you cannot have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you cannot have disposable people without racism. I think in a nutshell, that just breaks it all down. And oh, great, Graham just hopped on. Graham, stand by, brother. I will be at our slide in a moment. You're always early. I love that about you. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because I want to get to our discussion with Graham, because it's so great that he could join us. But this all to say that there's no coincidences of who is suffering the most from this. One of my teachers, the great Dr. Robert Bullard, considered by some to be the father of environmental justice, reminds us that low wealth communities of color are hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change and environment and public health threats from natural and human-made disasters. They're not randomly distributed, as we talked about earlier. This should be no surprise, just like with COVID, just like with the climate crisis, the poorest of the poor, indigenous, Black, brown, poor white people, poor Asian people live at the most degraded areas and most at-risk environments. I'm going to skip that. Okay, this brings us to Nebraska. While we have our brother Graham on in the first place, local implications. The good life, y'all, is on the line. We have Graham here who can really talk about, y'all like saw some of the acute impacts of flooding. There's a few bad nights where the old market, massive flooding. It kind of looked like almost like New York City during a superstorm Sandy, but real massive implications on one of the main sectors in Nebraska, right? They're here and they're staying unless we do something about it. This is 2019 in a rural community. This is just now in 2021. That's the old market. I know I've had a beer like near that area. I mean, it's just incredible to look at both of these images. They're in the same state, and this is also something that Graham and I have always worked on, is like removing this idea of rural versus urban. Here you can see right here, you're in it together, and the solutions have to be worked on together. So instead of like pipelines for fossil fuels, we're trying to make pipelines, or vines, as we like to say, connecting rural and urban issues, because Graham and I have found that they're very, very similar when you get to the bottom of it. And so, Graham, why don't you hop in as we start talking about some of the agriculture's climate vulnerability. This comes out of the report that our good friend Dr. Skolsky did, but I'll give you this time to introduce yourself and say what's up.
Hey everyone, and thank you, Anthony. It's always good to see you, and even better when we get time to attach at the hip for the cause. So the other day we got 4 inches of rain at once, which is all of a sudden become the norm. When you get that much rain at once, what happens is that some of these things, especially the erosion and runoff, start to play out. So the National Resource Conservation Service of the United States Department of Agriculture says that in Nebraska, the average agricultural acre loses 3 tons of topsoil per year. And it all just runs into our waterways and, down into essentially downwards into the Missouri River and onwards down to the Gulf Coast. And with that, everything that's put on it goes into the water systems as well, which further creates serious issues. And so what we're in the midst of right now on our farm and is trying to apply more regenerative agriculture approaches that increase biodiversity, lead by example. And so we're trying to deploy these kind of activities on our farms so that we can be able to solidify the soil, but also be able to create more life that is able to draw down and hold that carbon into the ground in a more permanent nature. And then also be able to utilize and advocate and utilize better grazing techniques that reduce some of the methane emission, definitely help us create our own fertilizers, so that we can eliminate more nitrous oxide emissions and diversify the farm so that there's more opportunities for more young people simultaneously to be able to get out here and be part of the solution. But our backs are against the wall. We have a long ways to go on this, and I feel like we're really on a clock because over the next 15 years, the majority of the land that's concentrated into the older generations is going to transition, and unfortunately, it's only been going to the highest bidder. And the highest bidders are oftentimes foreign multinationals, large companies that are in the race towards monopolization, big time investors. The largest landowner in the US now, I believe, is Bill Gates. And so we have a lot of, what that means is that if we don't figure out a way to transition the land into these systems and into the next generation, which we owe it to them to give them a chance to be part of that independent farming structure that has been our history. If we don't do that, my opinion is it's just game over for the climate. And I mean, already we're at the bottom of the barrel for a socioeconomic status out here, which has been eradicated. We can only do this if we have an informed consumer base, which includes people everywhere. We're all consumers. We all have to eat food to live. And so because we have lost the population numbers, the young people don't exist here as much as they used to, which means lack of creativity and energy as well. we don't have political representation. I am here, and I think on part to call action that we prioritize the next generation to being back on the land at this time. And the 2023 Farm Bill needs to be a regenerative reform farm bill that does just that, as well as prioritizes more biodiversity. If we don't get young people to manage this land, if it becomes just all technological based or in foreign interests, we will lead to enhanced colonization, as we've seen with the Chinese in Africa. And you can just kiss our climate solutions goodbye. It'd be game over. I don't see how we recoup unless the young people have a shot to get this right. And you know, I think this is a very important time. And so I appreciate, Anthony, you bringing me in to make some of these points, but we are up against the blades. We have the solutions. We know what we need to do. We need young people, we need biodiversity, and we need technicians to help them. Those are some of the key asks coming up in the 2023 Farm Bill, but we need to start at that now because those conversations are already going. And I should remind you that our Congressman, Don Bacon, is on the Agricultural Committee. Also Congressman Jeff Fortenberry is on the Appropriations Committee. And for US Senators, Deb Fischer is on the Agricultural Committee. They have a lot of power right now in having a regenerative reform farm bill. And this might be our best shot to get this right and create a transition that is regenerative and is a solution-oriented transition.
Thanks so much, Graham. Yeah, I don't know how much longer Congressman Fortenberry is going to be on that committee, but can get it in now. But as Graham was saying, you know, I just want to talk about the solutions now. I mean, we co-founded Regenerate Nebraska. Graham is still running it with doing just amazing things and bringing people together. We do say the solutions are in the soil, and they really are. I've known Graham for about 8 years now, which is it just blows me away. It's been like 7 or 8 years, but and the Yankees still haven't won a World Series in that time, Graham. But you know, that said, it was Graham who introduced me to this idea of Regenerate Nebraska through something that came out of the COP 21, the Council of Parties. I was just telling everyone that the latest one is starting this week. Agriculture is definitely going to be a big issue. This is about 6-7 years ago now. The French introduced this 4 per 1,000 initiative, which Graham told me about. And I remember just saying to myself, like, how the hell are we not talking about this more? I mean, this is literally a solutions multiplier. And the aim of the initiative is demonstrate that agriculture, particularly agricultural soils, can play a crucial role in not only food security, but climate change as well. It's supported by scientific documentation, as Graham was saying. It invites all partners to implement practical solutions on soil carbon capture, storage, and types of practices to achieve it: agroecology, agroforestry, conservation agriculture, biodiversity, as Graham was saying, crop rotation, the way we graze our animals, the way we treat our animals. All of this has a stake in how we can actually address this climate crisis. And with just an annual growth rate of 0.4% in global soil carbon stocks, 4% per year, would halt the increase of carbon dioxide and its equivalents in the atmosphere related to human activities. I just want to say really quickly, though, that, like, you know, to Graham's point about, you know, billionaires buying up swaths of land, we have to be very, very careful. I'm going to go back a few slides to talk about this idea of false solutions, or what I call the green unicorns. They're buying up land, you know, to try to basically say, we have climate solutions. We're going to co-opt the amazing work that real farmers like Graham does, basically to allow for the continuation of a business as usual scenario. That's not what Graham and I are promoting. We agree we have to reduce fossil fuel use rapidly. Graham is also a solar energy genius. He's being very modest, but he has an amazing organization called GC Resolve and GC Revolts as well, and does amazing solar and wind projects throughout the state of Nebraska. But, you know, and that's why Graham is walking and talking the talk. It's like, no, we don't just do regenerative ag and say, oh yeah, we can keep burning fossil fuels and coal and whatnot. Graham will probably be one of the first people, by the way, to get one of those zero emission vehicle pickup trucks when they finally come come online, I bet, and I can't wait to drive in it. But this idea of net zero emissions, which is what Bill Gates and the Ted Turner think they're going to do, is not right. And just this year, 3 scientists said that net zero is a feckless, cavalier, burn now, pay later approach. I've always equated it to, let's say I needed to go on a diet, my friends, and for health reasons. But one day I binged on a bunch of food, and I called Graham and I said, "Hey, Graham, don't eat any food today to offset what I ate today." That doesn't work in the long term. So it's not just about the right agricultural practices, but we also have to reduce fossil fuels rapidly. So Regenerate Nebraska with Graham here, community of Nebraskans bucking the system, as Graham said, in favor of the solution which lies in the soil, regenerative ag. Going back to the way farming was, so that our future can be the one we know it can be. It's everything Graham had, paraphrasing everything he said. When farmers prioritize care for the soil, they put high quality, nutritious food into our hands. This is what we're talking about. We cannot have a separation of rural and urban. We are in this together. When they're doing well, we are also doing well. Oh, I see my timer's almost stopped. I'm gonna wrap up so we can do some Q&A for Graham and I, and we'll let Graham go. And then, these practices, they do draw carbon from the atmosphere and sink and sequester into the ground. It's our best chance for removing rising greenhouse gas emissions. I see you, Sally. Is that like a 5-minute warning, or am I cut off?
No, you're still doing good. I'd say about 5 to 7 minute warning.
Yes, perfect. So as Graham was saying, we can go from a part of the problem to the solution, as we see back in 2016. And this is an underestimate, as Graham actually told me, like it's more like 12%, because you also have to consider the pesticide production and the transportation. But according to the EPA, ag accounted for 9% of aggregate greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. That's the equivalent of 6,511 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, methanes, et cetera. Regenerative ag, and the way that Graham is revolutionizing Nebraska and a lot of the Midwest, can again be a solutions multiplier. Better food, better health, better crop yields, better treatment of animals. I've had like when I lived in Nebraska for 2 glorious years, one of my favorite things was like going with Graham to buy meat from people that we knew, farmers that we actually knew who were farming the right way. One of them got stolen, our good friend Ben Gotchel, who's now doing amazing dairy farming in Maine and trying to bring it there. So you'll be happy to know, Graham, the revolution is spreading even to the Northeast. As Ben said, he had to go out to Maine and educate them Yankees. So that's great. This is exactly what Graham was talking about, though. Losing 3 to 5 like 2 trillion soil acres per every crop, and this soil degradation. And I believe that some scientists have said at this rate, correct me if I'm wrong, Graham, 50 or 60 harvests left. That's 50 or 60 years. That's within many of our lifetimes. My son is 6 years old. That means that if we don't change the way we farm now in a way to also address the climate crisis and just save our food supply, by the time that my son is not even of retiring age, we're going to have a massive problem. And with massive problems in food shortages, it creates massive social infrastructure problems. We're seeing that now a bit with inflation, right? Imagine the United States like entire food system collapsing. It's not going to be a pretty scene, right? So it's not just like the physical infrastructure that comes with the climate crisis, it's the social infrastructure as well. This is also some stuff that Graham was just talking about, of how we can really change everything, removing toxins and the way that we treat our soil by injecting all this crap into it. Communication, like what Graham does so amazingly throughout the state and the Midwest, connect people to good food and health. People choose pure, safe, healthy foods, like being able to go to the person that produces your meat and shake their hand and eat dinner with them before and barter with them and then take it home. The supply chains demand pure, safe, and healthy food because we are in control of the market. Farmers then say, hey, we all should be doing regenerative practices to produce pure, safe, healthy food. And we have healthy people and a healthy planet. And this is just an example of some of the work that Graham and I have done together. Like, look how much younger we look then. I mean, I don't think we've aged that much, Graham. I'm happy to see that. These are some of our very good friends who we love and who we collaborate with. Just really, 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 really fun times. So what I would just say in closing out before we start taking questions, these are the questions we have to ask as we're addressing this climate crisis. We have to make sure that we're telling our own stories. As Graham was saying, that we are making decisions, young people getting them involved, this farm bill coming up, we cannot leave it to bureaucrats and to big agribusiness people. We have to be the ones making decisions, therefore determining who benefits and how. We have to benefit, and how we benefit is with healthier food, more access to that healthier food, reinvesting in our beautiful rural communities and our beautiful rural people, and keeping young people on the farm, keeping farms in the family. As Graham was saying, that's like the rule, keep the farm in the family. Figuring out like what else we do will impact, like how we farm. How does that impact our water? How does that impact our public health? How does that impact our air? And then with the decisions that we make, and I think this is really important, how we build and shift power. We have to take this power back. As one of our good friends, Graham, said, I want farming to go back to what it used to be, growing things. And that's exactly right. We have to shift the power. And that's how we create this new social compact that's going to help us address this climate crisis. That's the TED Talk, friends. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. No, I don't want to do a new share. How do I stop sharing?
I believe it's if you hover over the top, there should be, there you go. Okay, well, thank you both for your wonderful talk and all of the information that you shared today. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. Graham, I see that you already tackled one in the Q&A. Thank you. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A spots. So the first one is, you're speaking out farmers. How do we get individuals in the Midwest or the plains who aren't personally affected by the social divide to realize that they are affected by the social aspects of climate change? Have either of you seen really good examples of this issue being addressed in a positive, effectual way?
Both have, but I'm going to let Graham start because like he does it like every day.
Yeah, we need to, what we say is we need to talk Nebraskan to Nebraskans, and we need to bring this down in a way they can understand, to destigmatize this, because when it comes down to relating with each other, we actually like deep down have a lot of the same principles in place. So like matching those principles is important, but that comes with taking a few steps back and building a foundation that doesn't exist, that's been crumbled, that has been decayed. And so we have to communicate with each other, and we need to also, we have to do it in a way that is real, that is meaningful, that I'm here, and I'm here for you, and I'm here for this area. And when that can be understood, it opens the line of communication that creates understanding of what we're all up against together. And so I would just add an example that we've had more, especially in the Dodge County areas, the whole Costco plant, poultry plant has blown up. We've been able to use these opportunities on something that didn't feel right to a lot of people in that area, a lot of rural people, a lot of conservatives, a lot of the libertarian base in that area. They started having meetings and they wanted to know more about this. And when we engage directly and get to know each other, we do have principles that align, and that allows for us to have discussion that the reason that you don't like what's going on in the government is because companies like this are so powerful that they're controlling the decisions of the government and those that represent it. And none of that is in your favor. And so let's start getting into a more structural conversation. And that's what's happening now presently in Nebraska. We're seeing more of that. And now it's more become, especially through the regenerative ag conversation, which it seems like almost everyone relates around, unless you're a part of the industry that only looks at capital interests versus social impacts and interests, or whether you're someone that is trying to prop that up, those industry interests over the well-being of others. That's not a very high percentage of the residents that live in Nebraska or even across the country. And so that realization is allowing us to be more vocal on the ground. And it really can start, I think, in places like this, where our culture does rally around food, agriculture, and we need to make sure that we're including nutrition as a part of that conversation also.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I do appreciate the question so much, Rebecca, I mean, We know what's happening right now, finally, right? We're exposing the fossil fuel industry. We're exposing big ag. We're exposing Facebook and what they've done to bifurcate and polyfracate us from each other. I have gone into places where like, it's like, oh my God, why would, a Black dude with dreads from Brooklyn go to some of these places with the gram? And I've sat at these tables with these folk and I've cried with them. I've broken bread with them. And they've more than you would realize how personally impacted they are. Absolutely, they know they are getting screwed by a big ag and agribusiness, and that like they're just on a chopping block. And as one person said, a good friend, they've taken everything and now they finally come for the soul of agriculture. I don't think that the social divide is as real as our media portrays it to be. And so when these folks see me here in Washington, talking about rural issues from Brooklyn, it's interesting. It really goes back to a mutual hero, Graham and I, this guy, Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, but he brought into his covenant poor white hillbillies, as they called themselves, from Appalachia, who realized that they were also being screwed by a capitalist system. That's really what we have to go back to. And I find that like, I love, people are like, what are you doing in Nebraska? I'm like, have you been? No, come with me. These are beautiful people who actually have a long tradition of trying to buck the system. These are some of the most radical union members in the country. You go back West Virginia and Nebraska, Blair Mountain, like the original farmers union before it got corporatized. So they know that they're affected, and they can't like hide from the climate crisis as well. Graham and I were at a Nebraska Farming Union conference a couple years ago where I first met Professor Shulsky, and she was talking about the impacts, like how climate change is going to start impacting ag. These like, very big white men, with their belt buckles, and they were listening to this rather short sister because they understand that this is their livelihood. And one thing I will say is that farmers take so much pride in what they do. They love producing food and feeding people, and that in itself is a massive bridge for any social divide. So yeah, but I appreciate the question. That's great.
Thank you. So we've been focusing a little bit more on farming, but to take it out a little bit broader, Anthony, in the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how our systems and our governments and our laws and our policy have, led to these systems of inequity and how they are driving climate change. In your work, have you found an example of a city or a state that's doing a good job of getting back to that policy and practices to help address those issues and to undo those systems that are driving what's been created?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll start with like the anecdote of like when I first was getting to know Omaha specifically. Graham was an incredible tour guide. One of the first places he took me to was the OPPD coal-fired power plant, which just broke my heart. You know what I mean? This is like classic environmental racism of, really the majority of the people who create energy that causes those emissions are white people, but the majority of the people that are breathing in that toxic air are Black. And this, as I said earlier, is happening throughout the United States. I am so blessed to be a part of a coalition called New York Renews, which is a 300 organization coalition in New York. We passed what some say is the most ambitious climate policy in the world, called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which not only calls for an 85% reduction in emissions by 2035, but also that 40% of investments to greening the economy have to go to the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. So we just started, and it's really thriving. I can't wait to coax Graham to come to New York City with me and finally get a real slice of pizza. But to come and see what my mentor started in one of the poorest communities, Sunset Park, Brooklyn, a community solar program that is now basically fueling, if you will, or powering, I should say, over 200 homes in the neighborhood. And these people's power bills have gone from like $175, $190 a month to $40 a month, which has created more disposable income for things like books for their kids, computers for their kids, clothes, vacations, right? It's important for us to have leisure time as well. So this is a beautiful program that I'm hoping to replicate in places like North Omaha, where Graham, who I already said does so much work in the solar, but you invest in people like Graham. Graham's going to invest in places like North Omaha. He's not just going to go to Benson or to Dundee. I know Graham well enough to do that. So yeah, that's like one great example. And I'm happy to say that, the example of in New York, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act made it all the way up to the White House. Biden looked at it and was like, wow, this is cool. And that's where his Justice 40 program comes from in his executive order that came out 140008, I believe it is, back in January, that called, all of these climate pledges that he made. So, it's good to see New York, my home state, leading, but it's not just about leading; it's about distributing. So, anyone who wants to come to Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and get some amazing Puerto Rican food and see this, and I know Graham would appreciate it so much because it's really easy to distribute. And what I will say is that y'all have public power in Nebraska. It's your power. It's public power. And as Graham was saying, of getting more people involved, I saw a question: how do you get young people involved? Let young people understand that is such an asset, and you have access to amazing people like Eric Williams, who we don't agree on everything, like we agree on like 90% of things, but he's available and he wants people to know that it's your power system. So go reclaim it and turn public power into people power.
Thank you, Anthony. Graham, thank you. I see you've been tackling some of those questions in the Q&A, so appreciate your responses there. One thing I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear from both of you on is, well, folks who have joined us for this presentation today, if there is one thing you'd like them to take with them, or one action you'd like them to take with them today, what is it? If you had to, there's so much good information today, if you had to boil it down just to one, what should folks walk away with? Either a piece of information or an action.
I want to lift up Mr. Person's question, because this is one thing I think is important, especially in Nebraska. Your indigenous and native community is a beautiful one, and they need support and to be visibilized. Graham does more active work, obviously, in Nebraska with indigenous communities. I do it more on a federal level, but I would say that really get to know these communities. Stay in touch with Graham, get involved with Regenerate Nebraska, because we have a sacred trust with the indigenous and native communities and tribal communities. I say all the time that Black and tribal sovereignty, liberation are 100% tied together, and try to live that. Graham has been a staunch, not just ally, but accomplice to tribal indigenous people. Get to know whose land you're on. It's very, very important. You can do that all on your own, and then figure out, how to be real stewards along and partners with these amazing people who are doing incredible things. Go to the Winnebago reservation and just look at what's happening there, and let's figure out how we can replicate that. But in the meantime, a real easy thing you can do is I will put it in the chat. Download the Regeneration Proclamation and just read it, and that's going to give you all types of information that you can get involved in.
Great, thank you. Graham, great. I see you're already unmuted.
I would like to use this to answer Kate Kahe's question around the land in more detail. So be careful when how you talk about the family farmer. This is historical context to talk about the independent farming business. The family farmer has a large part been eradicated and is becoming somewhat more of a myth, and some of those who still remain under that structure have been forced in a direction, knowingly or unknowingly, by industry players on purpose, the same way that immigrants coming to the north from Mexico and Central America have been displaced from their homes and forced into a servitude type system. And so what we need to think about in the context of this is more these independent type systems that allow for more young people to be on the land, because we need to have more people on the land to take better care of that land and to diversify a whole multitude of new enterprises that have been taken away from us as we've moved under the control of monopolization. So what do we do about this? Well, in my opinion, this is the most important issue that is not being talked about. This is not just the most important issue that is not being talked about. This is arguably the most important issue of our time, is that the young generation needs to be on the land. But right now, there's barely any young people, as the wealth is concentrated with the land, that can afford to purchase an acre of land. I mean, looking out the window at our farm right now, and it's raining, but that land up on the top of the hill that we used to farm and couldn't quite cut it in some of those down years is now listed at $12,500 per acre. So if you wanted to purchase the chunk of land of 310 acres together, that's $4 million. Who's going to be able to do that? And Kate, you're right. Like this is not right. This is not fair. And if there's other people from the young generation on this call, I just want this to sit in. But how does it feel that you're going to be the first generation that doesn't have the ability to access farmland in this country? That's sad. I'm sorry, but it's the true reality of the nature right now. It's over for you. And so unless we federally prioritize programs that are going to return the land to the next generation right now, it's game over for not only the next generation of farmers, but it is also over for having clean natural resources such as water, and it's game over for emission reduction. We don't have time to mess around with this. So what the ask is that engage in the 2023 Farm Bill. As young people, we should be radically engaging in this in a way that says, we want to have the land now. We will work with the older generation in that transition. What I envision is some kind of a transition program that will fund a landowner to be able to help shift over the land. It will create a loan program that will allow the young person to farm, which would be forgiven at the end of term, should they meet certain criteria, which include business management training, so you know the fundamentals of how to operate a system. It would include soil health and ecosystem restoration-based training, so that there are tools about how to do certain practices in certain ecosystems appropriately. And it would also come with a certain amount of time in which these young people, this next generation farmer, would be committed to the land before the land then shifted and that loan was forgiven. So these are ideas that I'm thinking, and while this hasn't been a Farm Bill program in the past, it has to be now, because we certainly owe it to the next generation. And, I don't know anybody that doesn't see this as a problem. So I think this is a legitimate ask that we can get together across the country and start advocating for, in order to make sure that the young people are put in the solution-oriented situation to regenerate the land and agriculture and much bigger things.
Great, thank you both. Really appreciate both of you for being here and all of our attendees for today. This presentation will be available online at our website, mccneb.edu/Hubbard. Give us a week or two to get that up online. And then our next event is tentatively scheduled for April 2022. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Wednesday?
Sally. Wednesday, yes. Thanks, Sally.